head on over to www.wcypodcast.com and click on the Support the Show links, or you can click on the Limited Edition store, and we will get those out to you. But without any further delay, we'll get right into the paper. Alright, I am reading this paper straight from paper copy, so if you hear the old paper rustling, then you know what's going on. This one is called Ritual Instruction in Masonry, Its Early History by Dr. Stephen R. Greenberg, 33rd degree. Masonry emerged from a myriad of trade guilds and craft groups that strongly desired to obtain employment and wage advantages. When the early craft began to crystallize into a meaningful establishment, the need for some form of ritual was deemed expedient in order to provide the craft with lasting values. Instead of unifying its adherents to the introduction of formal activity, the early Masons were driven apart by its perplexity. A man might travel but a short distance to receive a fraternal lesson, much altered from his initial ceremony. There was no imparted standards and real meaning to those principles espoused by the craft. Almost at once, with the formation of the premier Grand Lodge in London in 1717, the need for the formation of proper Masonic instruction was perceived. Without some kind of unifying force, the craft would be obliged to fall into an abyss of confusion, forever lost as a positus impress. What followed in the wake of this great issue in a former time is an intensely interesting and sometimes neglected segment of Masonic history: the formulation of a uniform ritual pattern and the fashioning of a means for its promulgation. The purpose of this paper is to trace the genesis of ritual education that has across the centuries deepened into modern schools of teaching and practice. Primitive Masonry may have appeared in England much before the 18th century in the form of a group of works found in widely separated parts of the country, from Scotland to North and Central England. These were subsequently subdivided into what became recognized as catechisms, named the Graham, the Edinburgh Register House, the Essex, and the Chesham, and the Chetwood Crawley, along with several less-known ones. Perhaps earliest of all Masonic documents was the famous Regis manuscript, which bears the date of 1390. A common thread linking all of these initial writings was the fabrication of firm standards upon which the craft of operative Masons might govern itself. The primordial ritual work were of two varieties. One was esoteric, which was communicated only from mouth to ear. The other was monitorial, consisting largely of symbolism and was set in printed form. In general, such masonry was quite devoid of exact language. Its presentation deepened largely upon the literary ability of the lodge officers. Though it could be interesting and even entertaining, the discourse was more often meager in content and barren of significance. Above all, it was provincial and disunited. The initial attempts to rectify the disastrous situation into which early English Masonry had descended were made by Dr. Anderson and Dr. John de Sauglier, who arranged Masonic lectures in the style of the catechisms employed by the Roman Catholic Church. These were later revised, but still contained many inherent imperfections. About 1750, Thomas Dunkerley, who was regarded widely as the most intelligent Freemason of his time, ventured with no small amount of literary ability to extend and improve these lectures. His efforts remained as the standard until 1763. Reverend William Hutchinson at this time appended yet another revision of this work, but this paled in fact and form when compared with its predecessor. The separation of Masonry into 3 degrees was strongly emphasized by Hutchinson. These were presented as the patriarchal, the Mosaic, and the Christian. For the first time, the 3 great pillars, wisdom, strength, and beauty, were suggested, as were the 4 cardinal virtues. 2 men were most responsible for the eventual evolution of modern Masonic ritual. These were William Preston in England and Thomas Smith Webb in America. William Preston, born at Edinburgh in 1742 into a family of considerable means, his father provided him with a fine education which prepared him well for the important work he was to pursue in Masonry. Preston was made a Mason in 1772 in a lodge which met at the White Hart Tavern in the Strand district of London. In time, he was elected to the Oriental Chair in his lodge. At once he began to enforce discipline, both in Masonic conduct and in ritual work. With an intense passion, Preston strove to improve his knowledge of the craft, especially in matters of ritual. For this, he sought out the most experienced Masons from across the continent. Soon, he commenced a series of Masonic lectures that achieved great popularity. At the grand banquet held in 1772, at the Crown and Anchor Tavern in Strand, several Grand Lodge officers in attendance heard Preston deliver a lecture on Masonry, so well structured that it was placed in the first edition of the Illustrations of Masonry published later that year. Subsequently, Preston completed his system of Masonic lectures, much of which still finds usage in every Masonic lodge across the world. It was this great leader who admonished his brethren to transmit the mysteries of the craft from mouth to ear. There shall be the most perfect unity of obligation, of discipline in lodge, of Masonic initiation, passing, raising, instruction, instructing, and clothing brothers, so that but one and pure unsullied system, according to the genuine landmarks, laws, and traditions of the craft, shall be maintained, upheld, and practiced throughout the Masonic world from the day and date of said union until time shall be no more. Owing to the absence of literacy among the brethren, emphasis was not directed toward the philosophical discourse, but was more often set down in the forms of questions and answers, transmitted only by word of mouth. In such discourse, the ceremonies of initiation assumed a major focus for the operative craftsman in the later parts of the 18th century, also for the speculative or accepted Mason. The first reference to the division of the craft into these degrees appears in the manuscript from the Trinity College of Dublin, dated 1711. The first arrangement of Masonic ceremonies into the form of catechisms was alluded to in the writings of Pritchard entitled Masonry Dissected that appeared in October of 1730. The catechisms were penned and are more elaborate than in any previous form. In it are addressed questions to those already admitted to Masonic ranks. These are accompanied by answers which rehearse the ceremonies of admission. There is no reference to prayer nor to any charge given to the candidate. Such would appear at a later time. Here, however, is found a step drawing the craft closer to the modern era. A catechism that occurred in England at about the same time is known as the Grand Mystery of Freemasonry Discovered. This represents an even more detailed description of the ceremonies of initiation, much like those of modern times. 200 years has served well to forge an unbreakable link in a kindred chain that can never be broken. From the genesis of the craft in 1717, a need for the proper instruction in fraternal codes was envisioned. This was first expressed in the Articles of Union of the two English Grand Lodges in 1813. Two fundamental issues existing relating to ritual practice. The first is the absence of agreement for proper procedure. Secondly is a lack of uniformity in the content of instruction. The latter stems in large measure from the want, until recent times, of a standard printed ritual. The transmission of Masonry from mouth to ear, often complicated by memory lapses and word substitutions, has led to work far afield from its source and content. Regional differences in Masonry have frequently appeared but are not a real problem. These may in fact create an interest in membership attendance from one jurisdiction to another. The regulation of ritual conducted in each of the lodges with the English Constitution was left to the decision of the master acting in concord with the majority of the brethren. Such a situation has prevailed up to 1973. More recently, there is an expressed intention to encourage a common standard of ritual throughout the confines of the United English Grand Lodge. There is a common thread existing beyond the ritual differences representing those ancient landmarks that have existed from time immemorial across the world. By this, each Mason may know another and share in a common experience unique among its adherents, a mystic tie. In a world, it would seem that some forms of ritual were worked in the early years after the establishment of the premier Grand Lodge in 1717. The use of the catechism as a teaching vehicle occurred initially during the latter half of the 18th century, and by the 19th century, under the strong influence of William Preston, this became widely accepted plan for Masonic instruction. In these formative times, there were few printed books. Ritual lessons were conveyed solely by oral means. Many schools were restricted to members of specific lodges. As a consequence, many Masonic bodies became independent. The ritual practiced among them assumed many forms with almost no central authority. lodge membership was small. Few had qualified instructors. A possible solution to this quandary was provided by the creation of general lodges of instruction conducted by knowledgeable masons of the time, at which any brother wishing instruction might so receive it. In this period before the union of the two grand lodges, William Preston emerged as a dominant figure. It was he who first attempted to bring order out of the perplexity then rampant in the order. During the final decade of the 18th century, Preston introduced his work entitled Illustrations of Masonry, in which he established 3 degrees of Masonry along with a system of ritualistic teaching termed lectures. These were, in reality, a system of questions and answers based upon the ceremonies that ultimately formed the prototype for the ritual instruction in the lodges of antiquity. Preston's methods became a model and were exemplified publicly 1 or 2 times each year at the public nights held by the Steward's Lodge, later the Grand Steward's Lodge in London, by the leading ritualists to demonstrate and to apply a measure of control over the authorized work of the premier Grand Lodge, albeit there was yet a lack of uniformity in work among the existing lodges, not making use of this system. In 1810, the English Grand Lodge constituted a lodge of promulgation to advance a universal ritual code by adopting a series of alterations designed to facilitate a needed union within the fraternal ranks. The Lodge of Promulgation later came under the influence of the Lodge of Antiquity. A number of important English brethren held appointments in both of these bodies. Notable among them was the Duke of Sussex, who, as the master of the Lodge of Antiquity from 1809 to 1843, became a towering figure in British Masonry of the last century. Under his aegis, the work of the lodges in Britain was strengthened, and a general agreement in ritual matters was accomplished with surprising speed. When the union of the two Grand Lodges occurred in 1813, the task of further ritual unification was given over to a body created especially for that purpose, the Lodge of Reconciliation. This was completed successfully in the year 1815, and promptly approved by the United Grand Lodge. In its final form, Preston's lectures were to be utilized only in an amended form to serve as a bridge toward a new pathway. William Preston probably contributed little to this revision because he was now too old and ill. He died in 1818 at the age of 76 years. His lectures were at the time being presented only in the Lodge of Antiquity and subsequently utilized only in a limited fashion. From 1852 to 1862, these presentations were held only for larger groups assembled in conjunction with the public nights at the Grand Steward's Lodge. As this plan for Masonic education deviated from the designs of contemporary usage, the ritual uniformity much desired was not achieved. Preston's lectures dropped in popularity. They were revived in 1924 in a format in which a lecturer delivered a paper on Masonic subjects of his choosing, a format that exists to this time. In April of 1813, the Duke of Sussex, who was destined to become an eminent Masonic figure during the next half-century, assumed the office of Grand Master. Almost at once, he launched upon a course of fraternal unification which encompassed the grand jurisdictions of both Ireland and Scotland. Within 1 year, this was achieved by the formation of the Lodge of Reconciliation in August of 1814. Its purpose was to promulgate a more easily assimilated form of ritual. Frequent demonstrations were presented, with much interest being shown by members of the craft. They desired uniformity envisioned by the Grand Master, however, failed to appear. New lectures for each of the 3 degrees were prepared by Samuel Hemmings and William Williams. These discourses soon came into question because they were appeared in a printed form, notwithstanding that William Williams was a prominent provincial Grand Master from Dorsetshire, and Samuel Hemmings was a church official of considerable note. It was firmly believed by members of the craft that nothing of a Masonic character should ever be penned. Although no system of instruction ever received official sanction by the Grand Lodge of England, the ritual exemplification given by the Grand Steward's Lodge was accepted as standard for many years. By 1857, however, interest in this activity had almost disappeared, so that 10 years later, in 1867, the famous public nights were, at last, abandoned. In summation, it should be borne in mind that the delivery of proper ritual in any age thought essential is not the raison d'être of the craft. It constitutes a significant means for transmitting those ideals cherished by good men across the face of the earth. formal ceremony does occupy a significant fraternal component, but this is not the total sum of Masonry. A man can be a good man and true Mason without possessing any inherent skill in ritual. He needs only to pursue the basic tenets of the order to become its most zealous member. The principal role of ritual is in its advancing of the craft by lessons, example, and dignity. This constitutes the real education throughout the ages of the gentle craft. It is not how rapidly we are moving that really matters, but in which direction we are traveling. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that little bit of history on the ritual and how it kind of came to be today, and how it is interesting that ritual and catechisms and things of this nature are sometimes used and sometimes not used. And there's a lot of debate over all that. So however you feel about it, maybe drop us a note on the Facebook page or on Google Plus or somewhere and let us know how you feel about catechisms, and if you think men should memorize that whole and completely, or if you think they should just be able to give you a rundown of their own understanding of it to be passed to the next degree, or should we not use them at all? It's an interesting question, and the United States has different answers to that in every corner of this great nation. We have in Illinois a very loose standard on catechism. We push for what we call proficiency, and by proficiency that means you went long form, you gave the lecture back in open lodge, but there's also a short form, and there's also a way to describe the degree and your grips, passwords, and all that secret stuff. And that's a way to pass to the next degree as well. So we have an interesting set here. Most of the time people do a long form catechism though, but it's always up to the candidate.